I'm Julie Lerman. I'm really happy to be here, not only because it's always amazing to be at a DDD focus conference where people care about DDD. You don't have to explain to people why DDD is so wonderful. Although part of what I'm going to be talking about is exactly that. Also, yeah, I'll probably be messing with this the whole time. I'm sorry if I'm annoying you. And also, is that going to if I keep moving this, is that going to create a problem for the recording? Okay. But the other thing is, I've never been to Berlin before, so I'm really excited. I haven't even had a chance to look around except for walking from the train station to here. And I had a beautiful ride on the ice train from Munich all the way to here yesterday. 4.5 hours, beautiful weather. It was gorgeous outside, except guess what I was doing? Working on my slides. Every once in a while I was like, oh my gosh, look at that. And then all these famous cities, right? Like Hamburg, Nuremberg, oh my God, I've heard of all these cities. So it's kind of fun. I feel like a country bumpkin from the US. Anyway, so I'm here to talk about other things. So this talk came about as a response to some conversations I had at another DDD conference, DDD Europe, earlier this year, which was because after a session that I did was focused on an ORM, on using an ORM for mapping domains to the database. By the way, does anybody use .NET and Entity Framework? So a few people. Yeah, so I do a lot of that, right? I come from this ORM. I come from a data-driven world, right, into DDD. So I was having, I said something on Twitter. And one of the words I said really pissed off a lot of people. I heard a little bit about that in the hallways. And having had interesting conversations with them about my use of that word, I turned to Marco and said, I want to do a talk about this. Can I, come to Berlin and talk about this? I was a little nervous because I thought, maybe this will be a little bit of heresy or something like that, but it's really not. And I was saying earlier to somebody, I think if it was a shorter time frame for this talk, I wouldn't even do it with slides because it's a talk that is just right from my heart, right? But I have slides to help make sure I don't go all over the map. So yeah, that's how this all started. This word purist. So we talked about this word, what am I thinking of as purists, and would it be better to use the word? Is this creeping up into my eye again? Would I have been better off to use the word principled, right? But then, maybe that's a problem also because I'm definitely not suggesting that if you're not going to be a purist, that you should just throw out all your principles, all the principles of domain-driven design. So what do I mean by this? And can we be pragmatic and help people learn about domain-driven design, or not learn about domain-driven design, but learn how to benefit from things in domain-driven design? So can we do that pragmatically without losing principles? So, and one of the reasons I feel about this so strongly is because I felt that a lot of people are being shut out of domain-driven design because they're told, well, there are rules and there are definitions, and if you don't follow them, if you don't learn DDD from end to end, you're not doing DDD, and you can't say, you're doing DDD, right? And that really makes me sad because there's so much beautiful stuff in there for people to learn. And this text in there is basically my rant that I would love to have just, like my treatise. That's my rant that, is kind of behind all that, but and it's kind of over and over again anyway. But that's really what makes me really sad because there's so much to learn in DDD. So, maybe what we can do when we're helping people learn about DDD is start with small things, start with pieces of DDD instead of worrying about the whole thing, right? And then I've heard this term DDD light, right, which is kind of not very friendly, right? Oh, you're not really doing DDD. But, maybe we can focus on core principles of DDD instead of just saying, the whole thing, end to end, that is the principle. And if you're not doing all of that, then you're not using it at all. So, when you start teaching people DDD, I use this a lot. I actually used this in a talk. I did a keynote a couple days ago to a JavaScript and PHP conference. There was like 500 or 600 or 700 people in the room, and I said, how many people are familiar with or doing DDD? About 15 people raised their hands. So I was like, yay, great opportunity. So I showed them this. I said, don't even read this, but I just want you to understand this is really the whole thing, right? This is really the big thing. But this is a really hard thing to start with, right? Are we going to start with this and say you have to learn all this before you can even begin to use the things in DDD? Or maybe another way is, now I do a lot of work with people with legacy applications, right? Maybe we're doing refactoring of the application, or maybe they've got the legacy application and they're trying to really just start from scratch, but still they have, it's not like a startup with brand new ideas, right? They have a lot invested already, right? So a lot of times I'm talking to people and I still even think saying, okay, now we're going to do domain-driven design. That is also pretty overwhelming, right? First of all, maybe they don't even know what it is, but still just the idea, like, a lot of people have heard of it and they know it's a big, big topic, right? So, maybe that's still a little too much to start with. Or even, I think this is too much, right? Okay, now we're going to do aggregate roots, we're going to do ubiquitous language, we're going to do value objects. So there's all this terminology. Now, the ubiquitous language of DDD is really important when you get to that point where you're having conversations, so people know what you're talking about, right? But I even, looking at some of the DDD books, I would read through them, and it was like just constantly saying these terms, like they were using the terms as a way to describe everything, but I didn't understand the terms, right? So I don't like starting with that. And I actually just like to dive in, right? I don't know, has anybody ever done event storming or taken a class in event storming with any of those people, right? And the whole thing with event storming is you don't spend a lot of time explaining it, you just start doing it. And that's how I feel with domain-driven design. Just to start doing this stuff, maybe, doing some of the work, whether it's in the code or, on a whiteboard, doing some modeling or something like that. Don't tell them that you're doing DDD, right? Because they'll just start doing stuff and they'll be like, oh yeah, that's working, that's interesting, like get them caught, get them excited. Then eventually you can tell them, by the way, you're doing some, and but you don't say now you're doing DDD, right? That's not quite the process. And I thought this was nice when Michael Feathers mentioned this morning, because I had already been thinking about this idea of, like I feel like I'm doing it kind of inside out. And he was suggesting, with DDD, we start with language. We start by defining the ubiquitous language, and then we build a model. We model that language. We build structure on top of that. But a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm going the other way around. And he was talking about that this morning, not saying this is what we should do, but isn't it okay to have this as another path into domain-driven design? So starting with this kind of a garden, right? Like maybe not the most beautiful garden, but we can grow out. And I've been doing that myself, right, over the years. And I think many of you may have heard Eric Evans explaining that he really wishes now that if he was going to rewrite the book, that he would start, oh, there it goes again. It keeps sliding off my ear. So professional. I don't know. I just put it on wrong. Maybe I just want a microphone. Okay, we'll try it again. I'm not cutting my hair to solve that problem now, sorry. So yeah, that, this is even a tough one to start with, bounded context. And it's probably the most important thing, but also potentially the most misunderstood thing. And I wasn't at Explore DDD this year, but I watched Eric's keynote from it, and he was talking about this. He said this is his biggest fear, that people misunderstand bounded context, because if they misunderstand the bounded context, then they're really going down the wrong road. And that's what he seems to care about the most, what he was talking about. And I often use, this is a different version of, in his book, he uses cells as an analogy for bounded context. I really, really love that analogy. But what I realize is, even with my own path, I didn't really learn, I thought I started with bounded context. I've always said that I started with bounded context, but I realized what I really started with was boundaries, because I didn't understand bounded context at first. And I think that's a really important distinction. The boundaries are what got me hooked. The boundaries of bounded context. I didn't really understand what was going on in the bounded context, though. I didn't at first understand, the ubiquitous language was part of the bounded context, right? So, but I started with the boundaries, and that was my hook into DDD. And I do feel like I am for a lot of people, especially people who are aware of me or follow my work in .NET technologies and things like that, they've watched me go through this transition over about the last 8 years or so. And I've been programming for over 30 years, and I started when I was 5. I like that joke because you're screwed if you don't laugh, and you're screwed worse if you do laugh. So thanks a lot. But I really am. I feel like I am always like a canary in the coal mine, right? But people, I have literally had people tell me when they see me going through this learning process and that I survived it, it helps them so much, because they're like, and I tell people, look, if I am not a genius, I am not a philosopher like Eric, I really don't, I'm not like brilliant person, I am a pit bull, right? It's more like that when I want to learn something, right? So I've been told by people that it really helps them a lot to see me. They're like, oh, I say, if I can learn it, you can learn it. And I try to share that, and I try to use my learning curves and my aha moments to help other people learn the same things that I'm working on. So I want to first show you kind of how my path to DDD happened. I did start with a domain focus. As a matter of fact, the reason I finally discovered Eric's book, and it had already been around for about 7 or 8 years, was with the work I was doing with Entity Framework. It was really controversial with kind of the agile, people who were doing agile practices, which I wasn't really familiar with. I'd come up from FoxPro and Access and, define, forms over data, right? That's, back in the old days, that's kind of how I learned. So I discovered Eric's book by way of Entity Framework, which seems kind of antithetical, because Jimmy Nilsson had done a little interview on like QCon's website, and they were asking him questions about what he thought about Entity Framework. I was really curious about that. And at the end of the little interview, they said, what is your favorite tech book? And he said, oh, it's Eric Evans' Domain-Driven Design, because it's written like poetry. And I was writing my first tech book then, and I thought, poetry? What's that? Wow, yeah, I want to be like that. So I went and got the book, and the very first thing I started reading about was the client collaboration, which is something that had always been really, really important to me. So that's actually how I kind of, finally got my hook into DDD. But truly, the first big idea that I got from DDD was focusing, was the D, one of those Ds in DDD, the first one, domain, focusing on the domain. So that was really my first thing where I really started rethinking how I approached looking at software, thinking about software is the domain. Then I started thinking about boundaries. And I actually started this, when I first created this slide, That said bounded context. And I actually, this idea that it was about the boundaries just came to me in the last few days, which was kind of interesting. Then I struggled with this business about separate databases for everything, right? Especially, people would, I struggled. I'm trying to think if there's anybody here that was in the room at the time. I don't think so. I was at a small gathering that Eric had invited me to in Maine, and Von Vernon was there, and Alberto was there, and all these people. And Eric had included me because, even though I was doing something really differently, I was reaching a new audience. And so he wanted to, really encourage me and stuff. It was really amazing to be there. And I was standing in front of a whiteboard with Alberto and Vaughn and some other people. And it was almost like, what is it called when somebody's a drug addict and an intervention? Is that it? An intervention, right? And they're trying to get you off the drug. And the conversation we were having was about, having separate databases and having separate data, having repeated data, duplicate data in your separate databases. And I've always been, relational database and, everything normalized and don't repeat yourself and all of that. And it really was, because I was just going, no. Eventually, Eric wandered over. He was like, what is going on over here? And he said to me, there's a point at which, and these are my words, I don't remember exactly how he expressed it, but there's a point at which you have to make a choice to pick your poison between where you're going to pay the price of the pain, right? And he said, you can make it easy in the database by doing all that normalization, and then you're going to have a painful price to pay in your code and your architecture and your design. Or if you trust me, right, the pain of having different databases, and I share this with with people. But the pain of having the different databases and duplicating things in code too, is actually a lot less because we have patterns to solve that pain. Whereas we've never been really able to come up with patterns to solve the pain of all the side effects that you have when you've got all kinds of different concepts overlapping in your design and your code. So that was huge. That was huge. Then I started learning about aggregate roots, right? So you have to understand, I'm coming from forms over data where my classes were just really an expression of my data structures. And then I would, have methods inside of a class, and I call them classes because I'm trying not, they're not domain classes, right? I would have methods inside of my class that was like, oh, I need these children, this relationship, go out and get them, right? So really understanding, kind of pulling together this idea of, focus on the domain, not the data, right? Do not do anything about data access in these domain classes. But then understanding about aggregates. I mean, it was hard, I heard you about aggregates and graphs of data, but this concept of the root of the aggregate being like the master of, everything that it's responsible for, all its children and everything. So little by little, because I understood one thing, I was able to come to an understanding of the next. And then putting those two things together gave me the ability to start really comprehending the next thing. And I kept going through this. Value objects. I heard over the course of probably a year, 5 different people giving 5 different descriptions. Okay, a couple I read, right, and then others were people I talked to, or maybe in a conference session. 5 different explanations of what a value object was, and it wasn't until the 5th one. Not that the 5th one was the right explanation, but the 5th one plus the 4th plus the 3rd plus the 2nd plus the 3rd. The combination of all of those, because they're all very different. Finally, I was able to put it all together because each one was putting me too much in a box right? But by having all of them, I use the word triangulate, except now we're talking about 5 things. But I was able to put all that information together and finally comprehend value objects in a way that now I feel I can explain value objects to people, and people are like, oh, I get that. I'm like, wow, how did I struggle so much? You guys must be so much smarter than me, but maybe it was my explanation. I don't know. And ubiquitous language, right? I fought this. I didn't fight the concept of ubiquitous language. I fought the fact that I kept hearing this term, and it distracted me from what it was trying to describe, right? But now I totally get it and how important it is, right? Sometimes when I'm first introducing people to those topics, to that topic, maybe I'll say glossary. I use words that explanations that make more sense to people, right? And then eventually I tell them, now in DDD this is called ubiquitous language, and it's actually important to understand that because because then when you're discussing things, people understand, if everybody's on the same page, right? It's another definition, a glossary. So it's good, so you don't have to explain what I mean is this, you've got your ubiquitous language. It wasn't until I understood all those things that I felt that I finally really was starting to comprehend bounded context properly. So that's pretty interesting, right? So maybe start with bounded context, but for certain people, right? Maybe people coming from my way of thinking and programming for years and years, maybe it's not quite that. Maybe you need to understand this. And this was not over the course of a day. This might have been over the course of a year or more, and lots of conversations and lots of doing and lots of working with other people. This was really funny because for some reason I always blocked on the term. Every time I tried to tell people about anti-corruption layers, I could never remember the phrase. And I was building a course with Steve Smith on Pluralsight called Domain-Driven Design Fundamentals. And I was like, I really need, something to visually describe an anti-corruption layer. And then I started picturing Marvel characters, right? Like the Justice League. I'm like, oh. So now every time if I'm blocking on that term, because you know how that happens, like I will, like you do with somebody's name, like I always call that person the wrong name. Like Matthias, I always call, first time I ever see him, I always say Matthias, and then I'm like, oh my God, I said your name wrong again, because I always say it wrong. Which way is the wrong way? Which way is the right way? So it's the same thing. So now I think I got that down. But this isn't just that I couldn't remember the term. This was also about, it didn't even make sense to understand or consider anti-corruption layers too deeply until I really understood the bounded context, because the anti-corruption layers are what solve the problem of you've got the different bounded contexts and, how do you deal with that, right? Because it's really hard when you tell people, don't think about this other stuff, right? Because, especially when you're modeling, right? And maybe, their business problem is vast, and there's a lot of connected things. And you tell them to stop thinking about those connected things, stop worrying about the connections. And that really freaks people out, right? So what I'm able to at least say is, I promise you, we've been doing this for a long time, other people a lot longer than I, the patterns exist. So trust me, right? Trust me to know that the patterns exist. So we're going to forget about this other thing. We're going to forget about how it relates and just focus on this thing. So it really wasn't until I understood all those other things. So, slowly, we'll get towards this, right? But nobody's going to learn this overnight or over a year or, over time. I mean, that's why you bring in experts or you gather minds. So then there's this business of me being very associated with data-focused development, right? And a lot of people don't understand. This is, for those of you who, some of you do know, Entity Framework is Microsoft's object relational mapper. And I talk a lot about entity framework and domain-driven design, which pisses people off because they're saying entity framework is all about data. And I say, no, it's not. It's a mapper. The database is about the data, right? Entity framework is just how I can get from the domains to the data, right? Sometimes, not all the time. That's actually really, really important distinction. But people often come to me for help with entity framework and designing things, and I, am always doing my best. I mean, this is how I think, how I design, how I architect is a focus on domain-driven design. So I've got I'm a great pipeline to get a lot of converts and teach a lot of people about domain-driven design. But I can't do it by saying, okay, here's DDD. Forget about entity framework right now. Let's do this. No, they're focused on that problem. So I can start with the problem that they're focused on and then start teaching them things from domain-driven design. It is definitely something that needs, you need to consider the balance there, because especially when I'm explaining to people that you can do this, it's also important for me to make sure they understand that this mapper is not going to always solve that problem. It's not always going to successfully be able to get data in and out, do the data persistence for you. And equally important is don't start changing your domain classes to satisfy entity framework, right? So, with DDD, we learn don't think about data persistence at all. And it is a secondary concern, right? And I tell people that, and them hearing me say that is like, the people who know of me through entity framework and ORMs and everything, they're like, whoa, right? Oh, well, the persistence is a secondary concern. So what I spend a lot of time doing is making sure people feel confident that they can focus on their domain, and they will be able to do most of what they need to do for the mapping with the entity framework, and then here are where the edges are, here where you're going to have problems, and here's where you can't just use it to map. Here's where you're going to truly have to create a data model, and domain model and a data model, and have some mapping between them, and have a data model that better satisfies how and works with entity framework to get through, right? But my point with them is you don't have to start that way, and that's where I've gotten a lot of criticism or annoyance or whatever from some other people doing DDD, because what I'm saying is I'm telling them you don't have to always have a domain model and a data model in front of your data persistence, right? But it is a path of least resistance. And if I'm telling, it's like telling people that they always have to have a data transfer object no matter what they're doing. And I get a lot of people who, they're doing they're moving data around or doing data persistence, and they said, I'm spending a lot of time creating these data DTOs and writing mapping logic for the DTOs, but they're not doing anything for me. They're just, nothing's happening here. So it's more like, I try to explain to them, you don't have to default to that because somebody told you that's how to do it. A big message I'd like to give to people a lot is, look, you're experienced, you're intelligent, you know what's working and what's not working. All this stuff is guidance, right? It's not rules. It's not hard and fast and core rules. As long as we stick with principles and we understand what principles are the important ones to focus on. So it's the same thing with, trying to help people get the benefit of modeling domains and having aggregate roots and following these great practices and this great guidance we get from DDD, but still being able to benefit from using, if they're using a relational database, still being able to benefit from the nice things that this mapper can do for you. So maybe, and by the way, I'm a Libra, so I am all about balance, right? And I'm also all about trying to reduce stress in people's lives. So a lot of the times I'm dealing with, like I said, people with doing either refactoring, or they're trying to create a new version of their legacy software, but they're really stuck in the way that they've been thinking, right? And I'm helping. A lot of what I do is try to help them break that. And I'm the canary in the coal mine for your standard kind of person my age who's been programming for 30 years and has been doing things the same way for 30 years. For them to see me come along and say, yes, I was totally database driven for 20 years, and this changed my life, right? This changed everything about how I perceive software. And they can trust that. A lot of times they trust that. Like, I went through it. I was where you are. I understand how you think. I understand how that works. And I understand how scary that is to think about making that kind of a change, right? I don't want people, in my age group with all the experience that they bring to the table to get pushed away because they're afraid to make these kinds of changes. So I love working in companies like that. So this is not an atypical path I go through, in those kinds of scenarios, that I'll start, I won't start saying, okay, we're going to do DDD, or we're going to build aggregate roots, right? I just dive in. But what I'll probably do, modeling, not coding, but just, whiteboard modeling, is start kind of describing an aggregate, right? Or maybe, it depends on where they're at or what problem they brought me in to solve. I would prefer, actually, if I could start by, defining some kind of a boundary. Again, I don't tell them it's called a bounded context, because at that point it really isn't yet. It's just a boundary. But help them get that concept of, let's just focus on this problem, right? Don't freak out. Don't worry about all that other stuff. Trust me. Let's just focus on this right now, right? So, we do kind of both of those. Maybe, start with one or start with the other, right? We get a little bit of the way in, and I see, things are starting to click, and people are starting to see this is really cool, and this is, this is making the problem simpler. That's when I say, by the way, these things that I'm showing you, these things that we're working on, are ideas that come from domain-driven design. And sometimes I just leave it at that, right? And then we keep working. So after a little bit more of that, then when I feel like they're hooked, right, and they're benefiting, they're seeing that there's some benefit in this new way of thinking, then I'll back up and start, give them kind of an overview of domain-driven design, right? So they understand where this little thing that we're doing right now and benefiting from happens to fit in a much bigger picture of all these things. So we're not doing the whole thing, you're just benefiting from the one, but this is where it comes from, and these are, how it's kind of connected to the rest of the ideas and concepts in DDD. So, this is what I feel that I'm doing a lot, right, is kind of opening that door. And I'm saying a lot, this is what I do, this is what I do, this is one of my experiences. The reason I'm saying that is because I'm trying to share with you how I've been able to help a lot of people, and hopefully that you'll be able to use some of these ideas. I mentioned that I did a keynote the other day, and it was to a room of like 500 to 700 people, I don't know, with very few people doing DDD yet. So it was a wonderful opportunity to just give them that first big overview understanding and explaining, look, I've been doing this for a long time, and this is really important, and I think I have enough experience and expertise to make that judgment. Maybe not working for everybody, but I just wanted to give you kind of an idea of another path. So, right, one of the paths, one of those garden doors I get to open is when people ask me to help them with their very specific entity framework, Microsoft .NET, architecture problems, right? And then I use that as the path to kind of do that. But the other is when I just get to work with kind of a generic audience. So I have a much different approach. So I do say, domain-driven design. I am starting with that, not doing the just do it first. I focus on the domain. Quite often, in this last keynote, it was really about my transition from database-driven to domain-driven. So I did talk about the idea of, it's focusing on the domain where the data persistence becomes a cross-cutting concern, kind of like, security and other things. Except, I always like to make the joke, unless you're building the next Dropbox, right? Then data persistence is your core domain. And just give them the big ideas, right? We're going from the big messy problems that we have to small, solvable, contained, and interconnected problems. So I'm always going back to this idea that Eric had in his book, 15 years ago, right? About the cells, because it's such a great analogy about how the membranes of the cells, they're not only do they act as the boundaries, but within those membranes are our, Justice League? ACLs, anti-corruption layers, right? They define what information goes from one cell to another, and they maybe do interpretations and translations in between. So it's really, really good. I absolutely focus on making sure they hear, how important it is to work with the clients, and that I explain, we're not just going to go into a dentist office or whatever and say, oh, well, I've been going to the dentist for 30 years. I know how this all works. I'll be back in a few months with some software for you, right? Which is kind of an extreme opposite of that, but that kind of helps. These are just some more slides, just to give you an idea of how I was going about it with this. I definitely talk about the fact that there is strategic design and tactical design. They are both equally important, right? And all of DD, the two of them together make up DDD, not one or the other. Although, for me, frequently, I'm focused on tactical with people because they're coming to me saying, I'm trying to do this data persistence with entity framework, how do I do some structure and architecture and everything? So they're past, I'm not going to, it's too deep in to go back out to strategic. But I do want to make sure people understand that is the full picture of DDD and how that's really, really important. And there's frequently, like on Twitter, you'll see, like every once in a while, a debate will bubble up about this, about the fact that, people are focusing on just tactical and they're forgetting about strategic and they're calling it DDD. And so this I like learning when people are arguing. That everybody likes that meme with like Michael Jackson eating the popcorn, going, "Oh, this is going to be interesting." That's how I learn. I love when people debate because that's interesting. So I make sure they understand that these things exist, and then I give them a very, very high level. Like, I go, "There's the whole thing. Don't try to read it. I just want you to see what the whole thing is, right?" And then, part of it is tactical, part of it's strategic. Then I drill in very lightly to strategic, talk about core domain, how it leads to the bounded context, how there are multiple bounded contexts. Then this is tying to ubiquitous language, and then, how that then leads into building the structure out of that. And then how that leads into the tactical design. Talk a little bit lightly about tactical, and then, these are really important for me as a coder to make sure I'm talking about these things. So I am definitely, in the work that I do that's DDD focused, it's much more focused on the tactical than the strategic. I haven't had clients who have invited me to come in and help them, do the huge planning and do the collaboration. I'm usually brought in with the tactical stuff, so that's really my focus. So making sure, that they understand, not that they need to walk away with a deep understanding of these things, but I just want them to be aware that these are the important things. And also something that had really changed how I think about designing things was reducing the side effects of relationships, right? Like thinking, like I had always, both two-way navigations, and I have one-to-one relationships all the time. And reading something that von Vernon said, which was more often what you might think of as a one-to-one relationship, it's actually more often solved with value objects, and one-to-one relationships are actually much less frequent, right? And I was like, whoa, okay, that's a big, important thing that changed the way I thought about things. So, I like to share that. But then, back to kind of big picture stuff, right? The importance of don't model everything, right? There's a lot of things that don't need to be modeled with all of that intensity that we have with domain-driven design. Like some things just crud, data in, data out. Sometimes it's just fine, right? So people need to first understand that, and then, having the kind of wisdom and experience to kind of make those decisions. When is it complex enough that I'm going to benefit from doing this extra work, and when does it not make too much sense to do that? So I've seen these, we've got I've heard the DDD light terminology before, and I think I mentioned earlier, it sounds, I don't think insulting is the right word, but, it's not very inviting. So, I wonder if maybe another term, and this isn't because I'm in Microsoft space and, we've got .NET Core and EF Core now, but, it's just core is one of those words, right? So, maybe we need a DDD core. Maybe we need another way to think of it that makes DDD accessible to a new group of people that might have been shut out before because it's overwhelming, or because of the rules, or because of the definitions. And it was interesting watching Eric's keynote from Explore DDD, because he also was saying, maybe we're over-defining things, right? Maybe we're putting too much strictness into it. So, I wonder if there's just another way we can describe, an additional way we can describe DDD that is inviting to, new people coming into it. Just an idea. And the reason for me is because there is so much amazing stuff in DDD, even if you're using just pieces of it, right? From whether it's strategic or the tactical DDD, right? There's so many amazing ideas in there, and people can benefit from one thing, even if they're not doing all the rest, even if they're not doing DDD, right? People can benefit from just understanding, we don't have to have this big pile of everything connected. We can start putting things in, like having these subdomains, but, not using the terminology, right? We can just break things up and have patterns for making those connections, right? Instead of freaking out about, well, we have these relationships and, so everything needs to be in one big pile, right? That's huge. Or, the domain thinking, like really for me, just being able to have this comprehension that the data persistence can be secondary, right? That if by separation of concerns, so separating the business problems and the domain logic from the data persistence, that's huge, right? And, each of these ideas, people can benefit from them even if they're not doing the whole thing or doing any other ideas. They can benefit from just one thing, right? So why shut them out from that? Or why not find a way to teach them just one piece instead of saying, here, go, well, first you better go read the blue book, right? What I try to do is give people, that garden door, give them some understanding. And I've actually heard from people who have done that DDD Fundamentals course on Pluralsight and said, I tried to read the blue book, and I was really overwhelmed. And Eric has also said a lot of reasons the DDD projects fail is because people don't get all the way through the book, right? So that's why he's talked about restructuring it. But they've said that they'll watch this fundamentals course, which just gives them the kind of overview and confidence, and then they've gone back and read the book, and it made sense to them. God, that made me happy. It's like, that's why I'm doing it. So this is really just what I want to finish with is, don't let those perceived rules or strict definitions shut people out of being able to benefit. I mean, we're all here at this conference, I'm assuming, because you know that DDD is wonderful and has so much to offer. And whether problem solving or changing the way we design, changing the way we approach solving the problems of domains or businesses. And I want everybody to benefit from it. So I would love to be able to think of new ways to approach that and to bring more people in. And that's my message. And I'm not going to worry about the fact that there's 10 more minutes left unless people want to ask questions or make statements or anything. All right, well, then we can go get lunch before all the rest of them get out there. Thank you so much.